And we'll play through the beginning of the game, and then we'll jump to the middle of the game, play through that, and then we'll show you some never-before-seen features that are not actually in the game, but are useful to talk about just to figure out how we got to the game.
Much better at starting things than finishing things. When she died, she left behind over 300 canvases, not one of them finished, along with Monroe, who felt pretty unfinished himself. The orphanage allowed him to keep only one painting, and so he chose the Unfinished Swan that had always been his mother's favorite. But that night, he woke up to find the swan had disappeared. So he took his mother's silver paintbrush and followed the footprints into a little door he hadn't seen before.
So the game begins with a completely white screen, and we find players usually spend about 5 seconds or so waiting for the game to tell them what to do. And then they get bored and they start pressing some buttons. And they can hear the player start to move around and jump. And then they get even more bored and start pressing all the buttons. And then they eventually hit the triggers and fire these black paintballs. Like I said, it takes usually about 5 seconds, although we have seen it take up to 2 minutes for a player to get that bored and begin pressing buttons. Because at this point, gamers are used to the game laying out exactly what the game is about and what they have to do as players. And this game goes in the opposite direction. So it's a game about exploration, and we wanted players to feel like they were exploring not only the world, like physically exploring it, but then also exploring the game itself and figuring out, as they play the game, what sort of a game and what sort of a world this is going to be. So we start off with a very abstract space. In the beginning, it's all solid lines and kind of boxy room, and eventually we layer in a bit more of a natural environment. So players realize that they're not on the moon here; they're in like a forest, basically. And everything initially is very static, and now we start to see the world is actually a little bit more alive than players might have initially expected. This is the first creature the players see, is a frog, that ends up being eaten by the second creature that the players see. And for inspiration for the game, we looked to a lot of storyboards. So we wanted to create this experience that would evoke a sense of awe and wonder, and found that the things that did that the best for us were Alice in Wonderland particularly, and then also to some extent Edward Corey and Shel Silverstein and a bit of Jim Henson. And one of the things that they all had in common was this sense of a darker world that was not entirely safe for children, going back to even Grimm's fairy tales. And that's something that we tried to keep alive in the world. So even though it does have this kind of light fairy book tone, or fairy tale tone, there are a lot of things in the world that are not necessarily pleasant. There are lots of ways for the players to die in somewhat gruesome ways, but it's all relatively painless for players. So we wanted players to keep exploring the world, and so we did things like not limiting the number of paintballs players had, so that even though the world may occasionally push back, players were always in the mindset of exploring and feeling like it was okay to try things out, that the game was going to reward exploration and curiosity rather than punish them for it. So this is the first time that players are going to encounter the king. And the statue that the king has created himself, not a very shy man. He has a magic paintbrush and can create basically whatever he wants, which ends up being a bit of a curse because he creates a lot of unfinished things, constantly moving on to the next thing. And as players are moving through the world, they're exploring a bit of the king's life. So they're seeing the things that the king created as a young man, like this elaborate sort of statue garden that they're in now, and there's a labyrinth coming up later. And as they move through the game, they're going to see the king as a more middle-aged, and eventually as an old man, and the kinds of work as an artist that he's created. And this is the first moment that players have to look back over where they've come in the game and see all the stuff that they've splatted. And it turned out to be a surprisingly emotional moment for players that really speaks to the kind of player that they are. We found that everyone plays the game a little bit differently. So like hardcore players may start off and within a couple seconds of figuring out that they can do something, their first instinct to try and do is just try to do as much of it as possible. So they just start spamming balls everywhere, where other players will be much more selective and carefully, artfully, basically try to throw as few balls as possible to make the world a little less messy when they're done with it. And so when players have a chance to look back over where they've come, it's a surprisingly personal thing where they can see the areas where they may have gotten stuck, for example, and it'll be all black in an area. This red balloon is the first balloon that the player finds in the game, which are collectibles that are scattered around the world. One of the things we tried to do in the very beginning of the game was to do away with as many conventions as we could of typical games to make something that is very unlike a normal game, and we failed in a number of extents, like having collectibles in the game, but ultimately we found that it was something that provided a lot of really useful advantages for players. Like gives a way to add a bit more life to the world, so that instead of having white space, we were able to
even created a couple of brand new colors,
and then also
but nothing felt right for
give players a reason for exploring places that might otherwise not have gone down.
And he soon found himself.
These storybooks that are scattered around the world give players a little bit more backstory on the king and the world that the king has created. And initially we expected that they'd be a hardcore thing, like the audio logs in games will tell you about the failed experiments that's, day 37 of the experiment or whatever. And it turned out to be something that almost every player that we see gravitates towards because the game is so minimalistic that every little detail that we put became hugely important for players. So that's the first area of the game, and then we're going to jump forward to the middle of the game, which, as you can see in a second, is quite different. So in the beginning, everything is all white, and you're moving forward very slowly, splattering the world as you go. A lot of players liken it to being blind, and it's something that, in the beginning, we really like how tense it is and how novel the experience is, but it starts to get a little bit old after about 10 minutes of novelty, where it stops becoming about a sense of exploration and discovery and becomes more of a challenge. So rather than try to take one mechanic and build a game around that, we tried to essentially create the first 15 minutes of an interesting game over and over again. So we're constantly throwing things at players that they haven't seen before. So hopefully they never get too comfortable. So we're throwing new mechanics, and then also, as you can see, the art style of the game evolves over time. Partly, in the way that the king character evolves over time. So, instead of creating, the labyrinths that he was making earlier in Statue Gardens, now he's creating this vast world, sort of an empire, a city-state that the player has a chance to look up. And instead of moving, sort of 5 feet at a time, the player can run through the world and see where they're going. And now we introduce the vine growing mechanic that we have in the game, where the player can splat these water balls in front of the vines, and the vines will grow up pretty much any surface that the player encounters. And it's corollary to the way that initially they're splatting the world with these black paint splats, and now they're sort of drawing in these green lines of the vines across the world. And one of our goals of the game was to make players feel a little bit like a child. And one of the best ways we found that was to be able to give players the ability to make a mess. So by the time they're done, they can look back and see a horde of vines that has covered the areas where they've been. The second appearance of the sea monster, and we find a lot of players completely miss it. They miss a lot of things in the game. We made a conscious decision about halfway through development that there were a lot of things in the game that a lot of players would never see. And it's a little sad when you work really hard on something and you know that players that are very goal-oriented will just be going in that direction and will completely miss the stuff off to the side. But maybe they see it on the second playthrough, maybe they can see it on YouTube. But we wanted the world to not grab control of the player every 5 minutes and force their camera to look at things, but instead to have players really, be exploring the space and in control as much as possible. And you can hear the swan in the background. So in the game, the player is chasing after the swan that is always a few steps ahead. And we found that in the beginning, when we were developing the game, and we had just this white world that the player was trying to make sense of, that after about 10 minutes or so, players started to give up. That they felt like without a sense of a long-term goal, it became sort of meaningless noise to them. And it was frustrating because as designers, we wanted to create something that really felt open and didn't tell people about what the world was. But with adding in the Swan, it turned out just enough for players kind of counterintuitively to be able to veer off the path. Once we told them where we wanted them to be going, which is the Swan, then players felt peaceful enough that they could go off, a completely different direction and explore the world. So we ended up making the world feel a little bit more open by making the game a little bit more linear. And the vines, in addition to creating climbable surfaces for the player, can also be used to activate these topiaries that are scattered around. And the next thing we're going to show is one mechanic that did not make it into the game and one mechanic that did, just showing sort of the development of the game and why we made some of the choices that we did. And this is our river painting mechanic that, as you can see, is fairly early on in development. And the player uses their water balls to create a puddle that turns out to be like 10 feet deep. And we had a lot of fun coming up with ideas for what you might be able to do with these insta puddles. Like here's a sponge dinosaur that when you get wet, the giant dinosaur expands. And ultimately, it felt like something that really should be a part of the game. We wanted to create an experience where players felt like we're giving them these toys to go out and play with. But partly because other games have taught players this, and partly because we ourselves in other parts of the game taught them this, players really expected an objective. And so rather than kind of freely exploring the world, they were poking at it, trying to figure out what do I have to do? Okay, now what do you want me to do? And we just didn't have a good answer to it. It's a fun toy to play with, but it's not something that really lent itself to the kind of slightly more goal-directed experience that we found worked best with the other mechanics. So we wanted to give players a sense of freedom, but it turned out that giving them complete freedom had the opposite effect. And here's the vine growing stuff, which we saw a moment ago. This is Kelly Santiago from That Game Company, who's one of our earliest unhappy playtesters of the vine mechanic. It was really fiddly, and when we started off, we wanted it to be something like, we looked at the paint splats as being just a paintbrush that you're splatting the world with, and we wanted something that felt a little bit more like a pen. Something that you could draw with, and that players could create, lines or whatever they wanted to do. But actually, in giving players more control, in this case, you're growing the vines instead of splatting in front of them, you're hitting the vines and causing them to move in straight lines, that more control ended up not necessarily empowering players, but having the opposite effect. So we went with something that was a little bit less control for the next version of the vines. And at this point in the game, each of the water balls would grow one vine, which again, we felt like we wanted to give players a little bit more control over what was going on. And the direction that we went instead was to give the vines a lot more personality of their own. So in the final game, I don't actually know how the vines work anymore because we added so many bits of randomness to the way that they behave that sometimes they'll do things that are completely unexpected. Even people that have been working with them for a year have no idea why the vines did what they did. But it ended up being a really nice counterpoint to something. So instead of giving players a very fine brush, we've given them essentially another paintbrush of throwing this green brush against the wall and having the world kind of explode as a result. So rather than growing one vine, I think in the game now it's something like 6 vines that just explode out for every paintball. And so yeah, ultimately we had this idea of making something that would empower players by giving them very precise controls, and we found that it was actually more empowering to take that control away and to just make the world a little bit more random and chaotic and a little more explosive and full of life. And we started off with storybooks as inspiration, and we wanted the game to have the feel of a storybook, which is something that we I think settled on a handmade look. That we wanted something that felt like it was the work of an artist, that someone had kind of painted these worlds. And it was relatively easy to do for things like creatures, where you had a lot of round shapes and a lot of personality to it. But unfortunately, the game is really an exploration of architecture. So as players are moving around the world, they're exploring the things that the king had made. And the king's not a very personal guy. He builds a lot of giant towering buildings. And it was difficult to get these sharp-edged buildings to have the same kind of hand-drawn feel that the concept art has. So we started off, this is the very first pass in the city area that you can see looks a lot like the beginning of the game. Right? It's very black and white, and there's nice minimalism to that, but ended up kind of fighting the tone that we wanted. Like we wanted something that moved away from the earlier part of the game to something that was kind of softer and a little bit more full of life. So we had something that was more of a two-tone look here, and then ultimately we went with something inspired by Pottery Barn. Like our art director, it's a houseware store in the US, I don't know if it's overseas, but he was walking through this houseware store and looked at the color coding for the boys and the girls areas of the store, and was really drawn to the soft blues and the very soft reds, or pinks, I guess, for the girls. And so you see like all the roofs in the city have this really soft, childlike blue that ended up being a good fit for the kind of storybook feel of the game, and then also just a good counterpoint to the rest of the game, which has a more high contrast and a little bit sharper feel to it. And that is the presentation. So I think we've got a few minutes for questions.
Do you have any intention for the opening levels, for instance, to have some kind of unlockable mode where you see it as if it was fully pink, so you can see it everywhere you missed at one time rather than...
Yeah, it's an interesting question. We totally did for a while, and then it just felt like it was seeing behind the curtain a little too much. And I was showing the game off for a friend of mine at Harmonix recently, and there was like a room full of 30 game developers, and the game was crashing. It was an earlier build, and I had to go into debug mode to do something, and I toggled on the mode where you can see, because obviously as developers we have reason to need to be able to see the world, and everyone in the room gasped. They're like so disappointed, and there's something just like really unsatisfying that the game has this sense of mystery that is so easily broken when you go into something like debug mode. So yeah, we definitely thought about doing it, and then it just ended up being something that we didn't like the result of. Yeah, well, there are 4 chapters to the game, so I can certainly say that. There are 4 like distinct areas of the game, and then some of the areas, in the chapters, some of the chapters have one sort of primary core mechanic, and then other chapters have a couple. So that's about as much as I think I can say without giving more away at this point. Yeah, so I think most concretely by killing players, by putting monsters and environmental hazards that the player is kind of cognizant of, and it turns out that it's actually a kindness a lot of times to kill a player. So in the city area that you saw, you eventually are growing up these very tall structures, and so when you fall off the structure, you drown almost immediately, or like get eaten by a shark or whatever. And it's much nicer as a player to actually be right back where you started from, rather than if you had survived the fall and now you've got to climb your way back up. So we wanted players to feel like the world was not totally safe as a human being in that world, but as a player, they were still encouraged to be going around and trying whatever they wanted. So yeah, mostly by killing the player, I think would be the thing that we found had the simplest and most direct result there.
And do you plan on giving players a level as well? Because I think it would be kind of fun to think how other players would think in your own level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would love to. I would also love to do multiplayer or all kinds of other things in the game. Unfortunately, as a 12-person company, there are a lot of things that we would love to do that we just can't do. But yeah, I would love to see that. I am hoping that when the game goes out, that people will go on YouTube or whatever and make crazy drawings with the tools we've given them.
You say you leave the player to make their own decisions and go through the game. What if the player gets stuck and just doesn't get it? Is there a nag sort of kind of help system, or is it just like, look, play the game?
What we did ultimately was just a lot of playtests. So we definitely had moments where players would get completely stuck. And in fact, the area that you saw right there, the city area where players were growing the vines, was one place where we see some players that would just spend like 20 minutes and they wouldn't see the vines we wanted them to do. So the solution for that was just a lot of playtesting and a lot of tuning. So in that area, the way that we solved it was by having the swan fly through and draw players' attention, and then the vines grow a lot farther, and just trying to have people fall into the pit of success, that they just feel like they've accidentally discovered this thing. So in the beginning, for example, the vines would, the very first pass on that, the vines would cover that whole black thorn ball, and we found that players were just magnetized to that. They keep trying to do something with that black thorn ball that had vines on it, so we just killed that. It's really just stripping away the things that were confusing to players. And so we really want players to feel like they're discovering it for themselves, but actually they're discovering things that 50 other playtesters had a hard time with that have then been like carefully stripped back. So yeah, I think some players will definitely get stuck, but our feeling is that it's better to have like 2 out of 100 players that have to go online and figure out how to get forward than it is to completely change the way that the game is and give people pop-up hints. One surprising thing also is that I had thought that the game would be suitable for people, players, I don't know, like 6 and up or so. And it turns out that there's this developmental stage, it seems, where like the 2 players that we've had that were under 10 that have played the game did not get out of the first room. They just discovered like, oh, I can splat things. And they just were like, I'm gonna splat everything. I'm not gonna move, I'm just gonna make this whole thing black. And they had a good time, but they didn't have that kind of more adult fear of like, maybe I should be doing something more important with my life than just making a mess here. And the game kind of requires that you have that sense of like, I want to see what's outside of this room. And for people under 10, oddly enough, they didn't have that, at least the people that we've tested. So yeah, it's a long-winded and circuitous answer to that, but hopefully, yeah.
Even though it's not, of course, a first-person shooter, I was wondering if there is a conscious decision not to show any sort of a throwing mechanism from at the bottom of the screen. The balls just spawn from the middle of the screen. Is that a particular reason for that?
Yeah, because it's easier. I think was the first reason that having a hand and all these things like, there's no good reason for why the balls are kind of like where the balls are coming from or why you have a million of them. So it's something that I think because we couldn't find a good answer, we just tried not to dwell on it. So the balls kind of magically appear, and oddly, like the more helpful it is for players, the less they question it. I don't think we've ever had anyone, like put their hands on it and like, where are these balls coming from? They're happy to have the tool. So we did look at things like, having feet in places would be nice, where you could look down and know that you were going to walk off something, but ultimately it was really hard to do that right. And so we were afraid that we would end up with a solution that, like, even in AAA games, a lot of the, the hands and feet and things, like, don't really look all that convincing. So it just was something we felt like we could get away with because of the minimalist tone of the game. So it was a problem that we, kind of avoided because we didn't have to solve it. Yeah, actually, the toys are things that you can carry with you in the main game. So, like, one of them, for example, is a toy called Stop Time that will stop the balls in midair. So you can throw them, and then they just like hang there, and then you can unpause, and then they all crash and do whatever. So like in the beginning of the game, you can use that to just like basically paint the whole world if you wanted to, like set up balls and then just like let them loose. And in the city area, you could grow tons of vines by just like making whatever you wanted or like making shapes. So it's totally useless. We wanted to make it something that players knew, like had no bearing on the main game, but was just something that if they wanted to mess around, and they're basically all things that came out of debug tools that as developers, things that we tried one day and we're like, oh, this is so cool, like you should check this out. And then we found a way to just like put them into the game. And they're just things that felt like it was in keeping with the rest of the game that was just, something to mess around with.
Sorry, I think we're...
okay,
sorry.
Yeah, you can come up and ask questions if you want. But thank you for coming.
Thank you.